Sign the crime scene log and cross the tape with us, Brendan,
and Hillary,
on our true crime podcast, Crossing the Tape. We are a married couple who met while working as a cop and a CSI at a homicide scene. We're passionate about our jobs and justice being served. Our episodes include rare, lesser-known cases that we found interesting. Subscribe to Crossing the Tape wherever you listen to your podcast to hear about rare murder cases, heists, forensic history, and more.
Hey, true advocates, it's me, Eric Carter-Landin, and today I have a special story, something that piqued my interest when I found a book about this very topic. And so I asked Jackie to help me write this. This is a story that I hadn't heard until I read this book. It's quite incredible, and it's going to hopefully teach you something about the history of New Mexico. I'm Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. From the time the conquistadors rode into New Mexico looking for gold in the 1600s, the Navajo had suffered. They had suffered for so long under Spanish rule. Many of the Spanish settlers had kidnapped women and children and kept them as slaves. The Pueblo Revolt would allow the Navajo to reclaim their lost ones, but in 1693, when the Spanish returned to lay claim to New Mexico, the practice of stealing Diné women and children would start all over again. Diné children were prized as slaves, and many Spanish households kept at least 2 or 3. Some kept as many as 8 Navajo women and children as slaves. As Western expansion from the east began, the issue of slavery was hotly debated across the U.S. This was an issue that had spurred several political battles in the original colonies even before the Civil War began. The colonists marched westward across the land like ants invading a pile of sugar, and eventually, they found slavery would be hotly debated there too. Texas would be settled by people who were mostly from Confederate states, but New Mexico, Arizona, the Colorado Territory, and California were still dominated by Mexico. The thought that people could buy and sell people like livestock would become a big part of the story of the counterfeiters. The fake money was used as much to buy food for the tribe as it was to buy their children out of slavery. While this story seems like the stuff of legends, it's a testament to the ingenuity of people who chose a peaceful, albeit illegal, way to survive. It's hard to tell where to begin this story since the regional history stretches so far back and the events that led up to this story began long before a few Diné men decided that they should make vessels out of iron rather than silver. By 1852, the first white settlers from the east began to arrive in New Mexico. The Diné had been living in relative peace with the Spanish who had been living there for generations. It was a grudging peace, though, a peace born out of fear and hatred. But it was peace nonetheless. The Navajo had settled around the Canyon de Chelly. They cultivated their crops of corn and squash, and they kept sheep and goats. They were exactly what the colonists wanted to make all Indians. They were farmers. They were settled. They were quiet. The white settlers brought their fight west with them when they came. The western territories were prized land, and there was no doubt that the U.S. wanted to claim every inch as part of the United States. But the argument from the east came with them. Would these lands be considered free states or slave states? The Navajo knew about slavery. Their women and children had been taken as slaves in Spanish raids on their camps for generations. The white settlers would prove to be no better. They would also take women and children when they raided Navajo communities. Admittedly, the Navajo would attack Spanish and white settlements, but in an effort to keep the peace, they would send any of the women and children they took back home after negotiations. The negotiations for the Navajo women and children would fail, and none of them would be sent home. One of the first meetings with the white settlers took place in Jemez in 1852. John Greiner had been chosen as the Indian agent, and the meeting was set to hear the concerns of the Navajo leaders and get a feel for where they stood as more and more colonists chose to settle in New Mexico. Greiner was considered a fair man, and he was not disingenuous when listening to tribal leaders. Delgadito, Armijo, and Barboncito attended the meeting. Armijo gave a speech that summed up the concerns of the Diné across New Mexico. Quote, I have been a captain ever since I was a young man. I have come to tell my great father that my people wish to live in peace and quiet. We wish to cultivate the soil as our fathers did before us, to have the water run through our acequias so that we may irrigate our lands. We do not wish to be molested. We have to depend on our fingernails and our toenails for support. By the labor of our own hands, we wish to raise our own crops, and like the sun, we wish to follow the course of nature. The bows and arrows we carry are to shoot our game with, the deer, the antelope, and the rabbit. But little rain fell from the clouds last year, our crops failed, and our young men have to support our families with hunting. I have lost my grandfather and 2 other members of my family who were all killed by Mexicans. I have never sought revenge. My hair is beginning to gray. I wish to live in peace with everyone. I want to see my cattle and horses to be well grazed and my sheep to be safely herded and to get fat, which can never be done while my people are at war. We, like the Americans, we have eaten their bread and meat and smoked their tobacco. The clothing they have given us has kept us warm in the cold winter and the snow. With the hoes they have given us, we will cultivate our land. We are struck dead with gratitude. I am now before you. You can all see me. My name is well known everywhere. My people are better dressed than I am myself, and although I am ashamed to appear before you so poorly clad, I wished you to see me just as I am, to tell you I can plant corn and wheat and raise food for my people to eat. If the spirits will supply us with plenty of clouds, we shall walk about our lands and feel satisfied. Greiner voiced the concerns of the settlers. My brothers, let us talk plain so that we understand each other. The people living in the Rio Abajo complain that the Navajos have captured their children, stolen their stock, that their fields have to be idle for they cannot work them for fear of your people. Is this not so? Armijo countered, my people are all crying in the same way. 3 of our chiefs now sitting before you mourn for their children who have been taken from their homes by the Mexicans. More than 200 of our children have been carried off, and we know not where they are. The Mexicans have lost but few children in comparison with what they have stolen from us. 11 times have we given up our captives. Only once have they given us ours. My people are yet crying for the children that they have lost. Is it American justice that we must give up everything and receive nothing? Greiner answered with, quote, You have never told us this before. The Great Father at Washington shall hear of it, and you shall hear what he says. Greiner wasn't totally honest when he claimed to know nothing of the slave trade. The Americans were well aware that Navajo women and children were being taken from their homes during raids. Greiner did send word to Washington about the situation. A transcript of Armijo's speech accompanied with this note, quote, There's too much truth in what these Indians complain of. It was the custom of the Mexicans to fit out expeditions against them, everyone claiming what he stole as plunder. They own large flocks of sheep, goats, horses, mules, and cattle. They are very industrious, hard-working people. They not only till the land themselves, but they manufacture their own clothing, and a Navajo blanket will at any time command the price of a mule. It is not to be wondered at if they should retaliate. When they so repeatedly suffered by these marauding expeditions, these Indians are now what the U.S. government is striving to make of all the wild Indian tribes, a farming community. I am so well convinced with the truth of the remarks of Armijo that I confess I had but little to say. If the Indians must return all the captives and property taken from the Mexicans, is it anything but just that they should claim what has been stolen from them? I think not. End quote. Yes, there were those who tried to rectify the horrible circumstances that the Navajo were first forced to endure. Not all of the Americans were bent on the destruction of the tribes. At least not in the beginning. Sometime in the early 1850s, Delgadito saddled his horse, Cebolleta. He wasn't sure what he would encounter when he got there. He felt that the Spaniards may just shoot him as he rode up, and the Americans were not to be trusted either. He had no idea who was running things in that part of the country now, but he was on a mission. He wanted to learn to work silver. The only man who could teach him that was the blacksmith. There is no proof that Delgadito was the first to learn the trade, but early accounts seem to indicate that he was. He would later become a tribal medicine man and a man that others would come to for advice. His position in the tribe, compounded by his ability to work with iron and silver, made him a very prosperous member of the tribe. He owned many sheep and horses. The Americans would later pick him out as a principal leader and would rely on him for negotiations with the tribe. This assessment of Delgadito wasn't entirely accurate, though. It's true that he did have some influence over the tribal government, and he was a medicine man, but the Diné allowed each man to take his own path through life. There really weren't any principal leaders. Delgadito worked iron for several years before learning to work silver, and he taught others the trade. He taught them to build their own forges and to fan the flames using turkey feathers. The Navajo were known to have created portable forges so that they could take their work anywhere they wanted. Navajo silver was prized at the time, and many tribesmen wore leather belts with silver conchos and shirts and coats with silver buttons on them. Bits and bridles were made from silver and were adorned with jingles. Henry Dodge became the Indian agent in 1855, and though no treaties were approved by Congress during his time as agent, he forged a bond with the Diné that would never be forgotten. He ordered supplies from the U.S. government so that the Navajo could build weaves, plant crops, and forge iron. He also attempted to recover the children that had been stolen from the tribes. Before Dodge took charge, the Navajo were committed to going to war with the Spaniards and the Americans, but Dodge spent 3 years negotiating on their behalf. He was killed by Apache raiders during a hunting expedition in 1858. Dodge spent 3 years avoiding war between the settlers and the Navajo, a peace that could have been maintained if only Colonel Edward Canby hadn't entered the picture. The Navajo were accustomed to grazing their livestock on summer grounds in Canyon de Chelly and on winter grounds closer to Fort Defiance, but Canby wouldn't allow such a thing. He told Delgadito that the herds had to be moved or there would be war. Delgadito and Barboncito refused to move the herds. They thought that the land around Fort Defiance was theirs as much as the land around Canyon de Chelly. The Navajo refused to move the herds, and that winter American raiders killed several thousand sheep and stole about as many horses. Negotiations, if that's what they're supposed to be called, consisted of Canby telling the tribes that if they didn't want to be wiped out, they would stay in Canyon de Chelly and not leave. Pretty soon, even though the canyon began to get smaller as Canby suspected that there was gold in the canyon. James Carleton would echo this sentiment when he became Indian agent. He would devise a plan to take the entire canyon and the land all around it based on a rumor about gold being in the canyon. He made the decision to move the Navajo to Bosque Redondo. He called this land a reservation. The Navajo called it a prison. Carleton was a man who could convince anyone of anything. And when it came time to talking about creating a reservation on the Bosque Redondo, his story would change depending on who he was trying to convince. He told the U.S. government that it was the best way to mine for gold. He told the settlers that this would keep the peace. He told the Navajo that they would be happier on the Bosque Redondo. He told them the land was fertile and that there was a good graze for their livestock. He also told them that if they wanted to avoid getting wiped off the face of the planet, they would just go and not look back. Carleton was an amazing liar. He convinced himself that this was a great idea and that the government would gladly provide for about 5,000 Navajo. He didn't count on 12,000 Diné showing up to the party, plus the Mescalero Apaches that he had brought in from the west. Through threats and coercion, he convinced Delgadito that he needed to bring as many Navajo into the reservation as he could. Delgadito weighed his options carefully before agreeing to bring the first 800 Navajo into the reservation. The trip was long, 400 miles, but Carleton had ordered his men to ensure that every one of the Navajo that came in were treated as well as they could be. They were escorted by several wagons carrying supplies, and those who couldn't ride because they were very old or very young were transported in one of the wagons. There was plenty of beef and bread to eat. They were given sugar rations and flour to make their own food. When they arrived, they were treated to double rations, and they had warm blankets and tents set up to live in. Delgadito had come to avoid war and expected to be treated poorly. This was not the case in the beginning. Delgadito was lulled into a false sense of security by how well his people were being treated. Encouraged by this treatment, he went out to convince more Navajo to come to the Bosque Redondo to live. Delgadito convinced several other bands to surrender and move to the reservation, but the more that came, the less food they had. They were given fewer and fewer rations. People began to die on the trail between their home and the bosque. It was estimated that on one of the trips between the Canyon de Chelly and the Bosque Redondo, 200 people out of 1,000 travelers died of starvation or exposure. The number of people who died along the long walk is unknown. Some commanders kept records and considered the Navajo their charges, but others considered them prisoners and not worthy of noting their deaths. Things were even worse on the reservation. The Navajo had to surrender all their belongings to go to the reservation. All their livestock, horses, crops, forges, and looms were taken by the Americans. They had no way to fend for themselves. The only shelters they had were the tents that were originally brought in for the tribes. There were no blankets and no clothes. The reservation was overcrowded with rival bands living in close proximity to one another and nowhere to hunt for game. Those commanding the bosque demanded food for the many people who had surrendered, but Captain Carleton couldn't or wouldn't get more food. He told the government back in Washington that there were 5,000 Navajo on the reservation. As people stopped coming in, the census was 12,000. Head of the Department of the Interior refused more rations. He told Carleton that if he wanted more rations, that he would have to deal with the Secretary of War. Delgadito had learned a lot from the settlers. The Spanish had taught him to forge iron and silver, but the white settlers had taught him to read and write. This didn't happen purposefully. The Americans had given him documents so he could travel and bring more and more of his people in. He studied those documents, and he learned what each letter looked like and what it meant. Before too long, Delgadito could write his name and read some of the words that were put on the papers that he carried. No one really knows when the forgeries began, but ration tickets would show up with numbers that were much higher than the original ticket that was made out for. Some of these tickets disappeared altogether. This was when the army decided that the ration tickets and any travel passports should be made from iron. The U.S. Army official chose to allow the Navajo to have forges to make metal goods and looms to make clothes. The irony was not lost on Delgadito. He now had a forge, and he could make ration tickets, travel passports, and pesos that were indistinguishable from the ones the army had made. At one point, there were 300 counterfeit ration tickets mixed in with the authentic ones, and the man who was in charge of the rations, Henry Bristol, couldn't tell the difference. They couldn't be thrown out. Travel passports allowed people to travel across New Mexico, and when the forgeries began, several Navajos slipped out of the Bosque Redondo and disappeared. Barboncito used one of these passports to leave the bosque. He went back to Canyon de Chelly and evaded capture for a year before he surrendered, with a few other families who were on the brink of starvation. When Carleton found out about the counterfeit operation, he was already surrounded by scandal. He was participating in the slave trade, which had been banned for years. He was keeping Navajo children to give to his friends as gifts. Carleton was caught gifting a Navajo girl to a soldier in Santa Fe. The soldier reported the transaction and the newspapers caught wind of it. It was reported in the Santa Fe New Mexican, and the people of New Mexico had a heyday with the news. How dare he force them to give up their slaves when he was keeping several of his own? The U.S. government was growing weary with the reservation experiment too. They had heard that the prisoners were being ill-treated and starved. Reports were coming in every day of children dying of dysentery and smallpox. They had heard that there was too little food, water, and hardly any shelter. And to make matters worse, there was no gold to show for it. Carleton insisted that he just needed more time. The Navajo could thrive in the Bosque Redondo. Public outcry was growing for all the people of the First Nations. In 1864, word had come from the Colorado Territory of the Sand Creek Massacre, where 750 women, children, and elderly were slaughtered in a meadow along the Big Sandy Creek. These tribes were headed to Fort Lyon to surrender and be taken to a reservation. They never made it. The politicians in Washington had enough. In March of 1865, the Senate and House passed a joint resolution directing that an inquiry into the condition of the Indian tribes and their treatment by the civil and military authorities of the United States. A few weeks later, Representative Lewis Ross, an Illinois Democrat, traveled to the Bosque Redondo to hold congressional field hearings on the treatment of the Navajo on the reservation. Delgadito was one of many called to testify. When Lewis Ross spoke with Henry Bristol, Bristol decided it was best not to mention the counterfeiting scheme. Bristol decided that things had already gone badly enough. The reservation didn't need another scandal. The Navajo didn't mention it either. When Ross spoke to Delgadito, the conversation was transcribed by a clerk so it could be sent back to Washington. Delgadito's words were not transcribed accurately, but the thoughts came through loud and clear. Delgadito: there's plenty below here, but we have to go too far for it. Don't know whether fuel could be floated down the river or not. Knows of some floating down. Could pack the wood if we had burros. The water has alkali in it, and they are afraid it will make them sick. A good many have been sick and died, and when they drank the water, they took sick and died. And others have got sick by carrying mesquite so far. Those that were attended by the doctor all died. Do not know his name. He was physician at the hospital. There is a hospital here for us, but all who go in never come out. We have physicians among ourselves, but they can't cure all. Some must die. They commenced to get sick about last October, and since then every day some of them have died. So many of them dying, they are getting frightened. A good many of his children and grandchildren have died. 3 sons and 2 daughters have died. They are dying as though they were shooting at them with a rifle. Question: do the young like to work and want to work? Delgadito: the young men work well, love to work, even the women. Question: are your women and children all pretty well now? Delgadito: all are not well. Some of them are sick. At this, many of the Navajo Apache leaders nodded in agreement. Question: if your people had plenty of wood, could they make all the clothes? Delgadito: yes, if we had the wood, we could make all the clothes for the tribe. All of them know how to cultivate by irrigation. Thinks there is plenty of land, but somehow the crops do not come out well. Last year the worms destroyed their crops. There's plenty of pasture for all their stock. Some have but 20, 30, or 40, but more have none. None have 100. They try to keep their sheep for their milk and only kill them when necessary, when the rations are short or smell bad. They depend on the milk of the sheep to live and give to the little children. They are honest and do not kill each other's sheep. They own the animals themselves and are not in common. They would like each man to have his own piece of land and work it for himself and his family. They have not grain, stock, and other things enough. When they have enough, they would like their children to go to school. They would not like to have their children go to school until they have learned all kinds of trades so they can make a living. Some officers at Fort Canby told them when they got there, the government would give them herds of horses, sheep, and cattle, and other things that they needed, but they have not received them. They've had to lose a good deal of their property on account of the war, and Utah stole the rest from them. They have been at war with Utah 9 years, and about the same number of years with the Mexicans. But before the war with Utah and the Mexicans had everything we wanted, but now have lost everything. Delgadito was quite young when the war commenced with the Mexicans. In the war, everything was stolen, on both sides. Women, children, and flocks. When children were taken, we kept them, sold them, or gave them back. The Mexicans got the most children. We only have 2, and they don't want to go back. Have not been in the habit of selling our own children. Don't know of an instance. They say their women sometimes come to the tents outside of the fort and make contracts with the soldiers to stay with them for a night and give them $5 or something else, but in the morning take away what they gave them and kick them off. This happens most every day. In the night they leave the fort and go to the Indian camps. The women are not forced but consent willingly. A good many of the women have a venereal disease. It has existed among them a good many years in their own country, but was not so common there as it is here. There are remedies to cure the disease, but they cannot get them here. They have no confidence in the medicines given them at the hospital, think it would do them no good. Most of the old men know how to cure the disease. They use the root of a wild weed that do not grow here. Some of the people are dying here of the disease. Some were taken to the hospital but were not cured. When they find out a person has the disease, they report it to the hospital. This they have done for some time, but all that have reported there have died. The custom of the tribe is to never enter a house where a person has died, but abandon it. That is the reason they don't want to go to the hospital. They would prefer a tent out by the camps for their hospital. Question: were you made a chief by your own people or by the whites? Delgadito: by my own people. Question: to all the chiefs: would you all like to go back to your old country or remain here? Collectively: They would rather prefer to be in their own country, although they have most everything they want here. They are all of this opinion and would like to have you send them back, and if you have any presents to give them, they will distribute them among them. If they were sent back, they would promise to never commit an act of hostility. Question: if you were sent back, could you make your own living? Delgadito: yes. We could support ourselves, and you could send some troops to see that we kept our promise. Then the question they all had been waiting for finally came. Do you want us, when we go back to the Great Father and the Great Council, that you would like to be sent back to your old country? Collectively, yes, we would all like to go, and if sent back, we would go straight back the way we came. Question: are the soldiers treating you badly, and if so, please let us know. Delgadito: the soldiers here treat us very bad, whipping and kicking us. Question: do you get enough to eat here? Delgadito: no, we do not get enough to eat. Question: how much do you get as a ration? The answer to this question was never made part of the record. Question: is there any game in your own country? Yes, there is plenty of rabbits, antelope, deer, and wild potatoes. Delgadito says they would like to have you send them back to their own country. They think you are the greatest men and can send them back, and they would like to have it done soon. Ross then told him that he was only there to perform the inquest. He didn't have the authority to release them from the reservation, but he would relay the wish to the president and Congress. Delgadito and other headmen talked among themselves. Then Delgadito told the interpreter, they say they will try and work to do all they can to support themselves until they learn what disposition is to be made of them. Then the blacksmith turned counterfeiter asked one more favor of the congressman. He asked if it was possible for the government to send more tools for a blacksmith shop. Carleton was subsequently fired after the inquest. Ulysses S. Grant himself sent him packing. The experiment on the Bosque Redondo was a total failure. Carleton tried to cajole his way back into Grant's good graces. He promised that the tribes at the Bosque could thrive there. They just needed time. He brought up the gold that he had never found. Again, he said he just needed time. He told Grant that with time, everything would be just fine. Sunshine and roses. Grant sent him packing. On July 9th, 1867, a fight broke out between prisoners and troops on the reservation. When it was all over, one soldier had been wounded and several warriors had fled with their families. A few months after Cadet testified at the inquest with Congressman Ross, he gathered all the Mescalero Apache and they left too. More than 300 Apache men, women, and children just packed up and moved out. They were never seen again. After yet another inquest, the troops were found to be responsible for the skirmish. The tribesmen were going about their normal business when some soldier got trigger happy. Congress pushed for the reservation to close, but the rest of the politicians in Washington were against the idea. The issue of slavery of Navajo children had become the elephant in the room. During one of the congressional hearings, New Mexico Chief Justice Kirby Benedict publicly accused Governor Connolly and most of the Indian service agents of enslaving and selling Navajo women and children. In the spring of 1867, Congress passed an act to abolish and forever prohibit the system of peonage in the territory of New Mexico and other parts of the United States. This came almost 2 years after the end of slavery in the eastern part of the United States. General George Getty would be Carleton's replacement, and he had a long, tenuous journey ahead of him. He again asked the headsman to meet with him. He wanted to know about the skirmish in July. Of course, Delgadito was asked to come and speak. He knew nothing of the fight, but he took the opportunity to state his position on the reservation. My thoughts are as they always were. My head and heart are for the right. When brought from my own country here, I was told this ground was my ground, and this water my water. I intend to live here and do what is right. The first time I planted here, I did not get any crop. 3 times I have tried to raise crops and failed. I don't like the Bosque because I don't think crops can be raised here. Since I have been here, I have not been able to raise even a basketful. I do not believe the ground here is the best ground for us. We have plenty of food and clothing, but we can't get 2 of anything. If we do, one disappears. We know not how. In our old country, we raised abundant crops. Here we can raise none. I feel sorry that we can't get sheep or cattle of any kind. It seems as if I would never see any more flocks. Of course, that wasn't the question that was asked, but it was a good opener for another white man to hear his real complaints. Getty was the first officer to listen to the Diné in several years, and he caught the ear of the president and other government officials. Those officials were already questioning whether the reservation was a necessity. Now, they were questioning its ethics. In May of 1868, Barboncito held a prayer ceremony. The Diné were still waiting to hear their fate, and Barboncito's anxiety got the better of him. He went to see the crystal gazers, and they told him that he needed a coyote. That coyote is a trickster. He means well, but he could use his power to change the minds of the army. He may be able to lead the people back home. 4 days after he went to see the crystal gazers, Barboncito walked into camp with a coyote that was bound and blindfolded. He asked all the people to form a great circle around him. Hundreds, then thousands of people came together. The circle covered most of the plains. Barboncito began to pray as the people gathered. When the prayer was finished, he placed a small bead made of white shell in the coyote's mouth. This represented changing woman and a new beginning. Then he let him go. The coyote ran first to the east. Barboncito yelled, "Not that way." All the people on that side of the circle began to shout and wave their arms. The coyote changed direction, but this time he went south. That wasn't right either. The people on the side of the circle began to yell and wave their hands. The coyote, just wanting to get away from the crazy mob, turned again and ran full speed to the west. Barboncito shouted, "Open the circle, let him through." The circle opened, and the coyote ran. He paused once to look back, howled, and then continued his run west towards freedom. Samuel Teppan was the next to come and meet with the Diné. He was the Union Army commander who had single-handedly tried to end slavery in New Mexico. William Tecumseh Sherman was with him. They invited 24 Navajo headmen to meet and discuss the future of the Diné. This time, Barboncito was chosen to speak for the Diné. He had been waiting years for this moment. He stood and spoke, quote, "We know this land does not like us. It seems whatever we do here causes death. Our grandfathers had no idea of living in any other country except our own, and I do not think it is right for us to do so. Before I am sick or older, I want to go and see the place where I was born. I hope to God you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own. This hope goes in at my feet and out my mouth as I am speaking to you." Sherman was taken with the speech. "I believe you have told the truth," he said. "All people love the country where they were born and raised. We want to do what is right." Barboncito let out a whoop and jumped to his feet at this. He was done with the bosque. He wanted to go home. He wasn't quite finished, though. He again broached the subject of Navajo slaves. He wanted them to go home as well. "Barboncito, I want to drop to this conversation now and talk about Navajo children held as prisoners by Mexicans. Some of those present have lost a brother or a sister, and I know that they are in the hands of Mexicans. I have seen some myself. Sherman, about their children being sold as peons by Mexicans, you ought to know that there is an act of Congress against it. About 4 years ago, we had slaves, and there was a great war about it. Now there are none. Congress, our great council, has passed a law prohibiting peonage in New Mexico, so that if any Mexican holds a Navajo in peonage, he is liable to be put in the penitentiary. We do not know that there are any Navajos held by Mexicans as peons, but if there are, you can apply to the judges of the civil court and the land commissioners. They are the proper persons, and they will decide whether the Navajo is to go back to his own people or remain with the Mexicans. That is a matter with which we have nothing to do. What do you say about schools, blacksmith, carpenter shops for the purpose of teaching your children?" Barboncito, another counterfeiter, said, "We would like to have a blacksmith, as a great number of us can work at the trade. We would like a carpenter shop too. And if a school was established among us, I am satisfied a great number would attend. I like it very well. Whatever orders you leave here, you may rely upon their being obeyed, it being done." The courts didn't help the Navajo get their people back, though. Whenever someone would pass by a settlement, suddenly all the slaves would disappear. The young captives would grow up to marry the colonizers, and they would assimilate and forget the teachings that they had learned as children. The parents and siblings of these captives would remain in mourning. But there would be no more stolen children. The colonizers were unwilling to risk imprisonment by enslaving any more of the Diné children. So any new trafficking stopped. On June 1st, 1868, the last treaty was signed. This one allowed the Diné to go home. Delgadito made his X on the treaty along with all the other Navajo headsmen, but there had been a mistake, and a red line was drawn through his name. Under that, he signed his name in cursive, Delgadito. June 18th, was the day that the Navajo were released from the Bosque Redondo. A line formed 10 miles long as they began their journey. They sang, "In the beauty I walk, with beauty before me I walk, with beauty behind me I walk, with beauty above me I walk, with beauty around me I walk. It has become beauty again." The land that the Diné returned to was substantially smaller than the one they left 4 years before. None of their 4 sacred mountains fell within its borders, but it was theirs, and they could rejoice in that. Between 1868 and 1934, tribal leaders would negotiate for more land 14 times. Delgadito would live to see all but the last 2. Barboncito would die 3 years before he spoke at the hearing that secured the release of the Diné from the Bosque Redondo. He was buried in Canyon de Chelly with 1 copy of the Treaty of 1868. Manuelito and his wife Juanita went on to lead the Navajo Nation for another 25 years after their return to Canyon de Chelly. He would continue to fight for the freedom of Navajo children in slavery. When asked by General Oliver Howard how so many Navajo children ended up as slaves, Manuelito bit back harshly. "You know very well how they came to be there. When this world was dark with dirt and sand flying and the stones were raised by the wind, and all were fighting with the government and themselves, you know very well how this thing happened when all the nations came against us. Then we lost our children." Manuelito may have never seen the release of the Navajo children, but their slavery spurred him on to become a champion of education for the tribe. He's quoted as saying, "My grandchildren, education is a ladder." He sent 2 of his sons to Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Both of them became ill. One died at the school, and the other died shortly after returning home. The Carlisle School would become the model for other boarding schools designed not to teach children trades so they could eventually support themselves, but to assimilate them into colonial ways. Delgadito passed away in 1870, just 2 years after returning home. He would always be remembered as the first Navajo blacksmith and counterfeiter. No other tribe has ever been allowed to leave a reservation to return to their homeland. Most ended up far from the place that they were born. After being removed from their homes, many never saw their countries again. The story of the Bosque Redondo was all but forgotten by 1990 when a group of Navajo schoolchildren went to visit Fort Sumner. Those children learned quite a bit about Billy the Kid, but sadly, nothing was mentioned about their ancestors who had suffered for 4 years under military rule. When they left the site, they left a note that read, "We found Fort Sumner Historical Site discriminating and not telling the true story behind what really happened to our ancestors in 1864 to 1868. We therefore declare that the museum show and tell the true history of the Navajos and the United States military." Today, that letter greets visitors at the Bosque Redondo Memorial and Museum. A census of 2021 found that the enrolled membership of the Navajo Nation was 399,494 people. It's the largest tribal nation in the U.S., even surpassing the enrollment of the Cherokee Nation. The story of the Navajo counterfeiters show the resilience and fortitude that exists in the Diné culture to this day. Their ingenuity and studiousness are what helped them survive to foster a tribe that has grown to the largest in the land. The ingenuity lives on in the great-grandchildren of Manuelito, Barboncito, Delgadito, and others. The greed of the colonists got them sent to the Bosque, but their integrity and perseverance brought them home. Thanks for listening, and stay safe, New Mexico.